We're ready to start our featured panel. Now, one of the features that distinguishes the U.S.-Japan Council from other U.S.-Japan organizations is our focus on identifying, grooming, developing next-generation leaders. And we've had, for example, futurists address our conference before, telling us how the world's going to look like, but we thought what we want to do now is to get their sense, the under 40, what we call the U40's vision of the future. So our next panel will feature the voices of USJC of people who are under 40, or what we call U40. Now, to moderate, let me introduce to you Lori Teranishi. She is a founder and CEO of the communications firm IQ360. Lori, by the way, is also my fellow JALD 2023 travel mate as we took our trip to Japan, and she kept us laughing on our tour, and she never hesitated to put me in my place. So, Dennis Teranishi, you've raised some daughter. Anyway, Lori will introduce the panelists. So let me call Lori to the stage and her panel.
So I want to keep with my tradition of keeping Fred in his place. I just didn't listen to him and just brought all the panel up at the same time. So I hope that's okay. I'm really thrilled to be here to facilitate what I think is going to be a pretty fascinating discussion with these four next-gen leaders. Oh, and by the way, I am not under 40, sadly, in case you didn't know, just clarifying. So I am the founder of IQ360. We're a communications consulting firm, and our work involves identifying stakeholders, analyzing solutions, and focusing on outcomes in the context of long-term societal, technological, political, economic, and demographic trends. And most of the solutions that we communicate, like Hawaii achieving its goal of carbon neutrality by the year 2045, will require years or even decades to achieve. And when you think about it, many of us in this room will not be in leadership positions in the year 2045. So as we develop long-term strategies to address key challenges facing the US and Japan, we really have to recognize that younger people, the next generation of leaders we have been cultivating, will be doing most of this work. And at the same time, we have to recognize that millennials and Gen Z have different skills, perspectives, and experiences from baby boomers and Gen Xers like me. And right now, Gen X and baby boomers comprise the majority of USJC's membership. A study last year by E&Y showed that many people in the Gen Z millennial generation are not afraid to question past norms, reject conformity, and really pursue change to the status quo. So with that backdrop, I'm going to introduce our four speakers, and you can just see how impressive they are and how much hope that they give us for the future. So the first, how did that happen? Did I advance that slide?
No, you're good.
Okay. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Kojun Oshiba. He grew up in Japan and moved to the US to attend Harvard, graduating in computer science and statistics in 2019. So just so we're all aware, that's only 4 years ago. And you may be fooled into thinking his career is pretty nascent, but Kojun has already done more in these 4 years than some of us have done in our lifetimes. He's worked for the most active seed VC in Southeast Asia. He was a machine learning engineer at Quantco and co-founder of its Japan branch, and co-founded Robust Intelligence, an AI company that protects companies' AI, with his former professor at Harvard, Yaron Singer. And here is Kojun in the picture with his former professor in their offices, their old offices. They've already moved because they've already grown so much they had to move, within 4 years. The next person I'd like to introduce is Sarah O'Connell. Suzanne talked about the Tomodachi Initiative. Sarah is a 2016 alumna of the Tomodachi Daiwa House Student Leadership Conference. And it was this Tomodachi experience that inspired her to move to Sendai, Japan, where she studied for 3 years, actively engaged in disaster relief efforts and community outreach, joining the Tomodachi Disaster Resilience Leadership Program. And she currently serves as a public relations specialist with the Permanent Mission of Japan in the United Nations. So she'll have a lot of interesting things to share from that perspective. She is, this picture's a little pixelated, but she's in the middle here, right? Number 3. So Sarah joined a dance troupe when she got to Sendai, and she told me she was the worst dancer in the dance troupe, hands down. But she committed herself to practicing every day, and at the end of her 3 years was chosen in a competition with her dance troupe to represent the whole dance troupe at this Sendai festival. So she has grit. Okay, this is such a cool picture, isn't it? It's Yuga Kohler, who's a senior staff software engineer at Coinbase, where he leads Web3 development and is a member of Coinbase's technical leadership group and crypto council. He is also a very accomplished orchestral conductor. So I told him, you're just amazing, left brain, right brain. He is the music director of the Ridgefield Symphony Orchestra, and in 2018 won the Paolo Vero Prize at the Toscanini International Conducting Competition and has performed sold-out concerts at the Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall. And this year he was awarded the David Rockefeller Scholarship from the Trilateral Commission for his work in establishing an open global financial system through blockchain technology. And if that is not enough, he is also the chair of the USJC ELP Steering Committee. So here, got applause. Okay, finally, our fourth featured speaker is Molly Kawahata. She's a strategist. This is so scary, by the way. I told my daughter, who's 18, these panelists I was going to be talking to, and I realized that I am bad at everything that they're good at, like math. Anyone who's had the misfortune of singing karaoke with me in Tokyo knows I can't dance or sing. And I'm like, I'm deathly afraid of heights. But anyway, Molly is a strategist. She's a public speaker, advocate, and former climate advisor for the Apama White House. She's the founder of Systemic Impact Strategies, which is a consultancy specializing in organizational development, climate strategy, and communications. And her life story was depicted in a Patagonia film, The Scale of Hope, which highlights this. Climbing steep ice faces in Alaska, her personal struggles with mental health, and her work transforming societal narratives by infusing them with hope. The film has over 1 million views on YouTube, and is part of the permanent collection at the New York Museum of Modern Art. She also serves in advisory roles for the Environmental Voter Project and AAPI Victory Fund. She resides in Montana, and I was asking her, how do I describe this photo? Is it of you climbing like an ice mountain? And she's like, no, it's a waterfall. So I didn't even know how to describe it, but it just looked so scary to me. Anyway, we are in for a treat today, so please join me in welcoming our panelists. So I thought that can you all hear me, by the way? Okay. I thought that we would just really have a conversation because these young leaders have so much to share with us. So I wanted to start off, if you don't mind, Kojun, with you. Maybe you can just talk to us about what you find the most challenging about co-founding an AI company, building tools for data scientists. Most people hear AI and we are inspired but scared. So talk to us about that.
So I started the company in 2019 with my co-founder who was a Harvard professor. And I would say the first 2 years of the company, no one really cared about what we did. And then the past 2 years, now suddenly everyone cares about what we do. And we're in AI safety, and we build a product to protect AI models from security vulnerabilities and toxic outputs and things like that. And when we started out, we were at the corner of a Harvard lab doing this as a research. I really enjoy attacking AI models, and we thought there was some gap between how people are leveraging AI and machine learning today and how it should be. And that's how we started the company. And when ChatGPT came along, AI suddenly became something that's used by everyone, right? Not just PhD data scientists and machine learning engineers. And so we got a lot of interest from literally CEOs and CISOs and board members of these companies that are interested in AI safety. So what's been most challenging for me is going from kind of working on technology and deep tech to building a product that is really socially responsible for building the future of AI safety. So that has been a big transition for us as the agenda of a startup that we're tackling.
Great. And also just moving to the US and putting yourself in the biggest tech ecosystem in the world, that's been okay too?
Yeah, that was a big transition as well, coming from Tokyo. Or I grew up in Saitama and then came to the US for college, and then moved to San Francisco once we started the company.
Yeah, impressive. Awesome. Sarah, you've worked in international relations in both the US and Japan. What do you find the most challenging communicating what the UN or the Japan's policy, decisions and interests in the UN or at the UN?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think first and foremost, I support a lot of really incredible diplomats. Oh, is it on? Can everybody hear me? Okay. First and foremost, I support a lot of incredible diplomats, many who are either 30 or just over 30, so also very representative of the next generation. And in my work, a lot of what I'm doing is researching policy points or other country positions to try and help them with their own negotiations and to make sure that we're really getting Japan's message across in the most succinct and best way possible. However, I know in the US a lot of the conversation is around Congress and questions about how can Congress not build consensus. Well, the UN has 193 member states, so imagine trying to build consensus among 193 countries. It's a really difficult task. And then on top of that, I think what we're finding a lot is there is a lot of idealism. A lot of us understand what the problems are that we need to solve around international security, climate change, healthcare, but even in getting these resolutions passed and in building consensus, we're still seeing a lack of political will on following through on the implementation. And so not just at the UN and not just between the US and Japan, but there is this gap between governments and people in terms of getting across what we're all really working here for. And I don't necessarily have the answers to them either, but on the communication side, it can be very difficult to discuss on promises that we're still struggling to deliver as governments.
Interesting. So now I'm going to turn to Yuga. You are a musician and an engineer. What role do you think art and technology respectively play in the US-Japan relationship?
Yeah, well, both of my parents are classical musicians, which is how I got into it. But my favorite form of art, at least right now, is anime. So on the art side, I think that Japan has done an amazing job of using its cultural output towards soft power. So, for example, 5 of the top 15 top pieces of intellectual property are Japanese, ranging from Pokemon to Hello Kitty to my favorite, Dragon Ball. And we see this throughout the arts, whether it's in literature, Haruki Murakami, or in the visual arts. There's lots of Japanese influence in arts. On the tech side, I think there is some cause for concern, or at least for us to come to attention. Ambassador Tai earlier talked about economic security, being at the forefront of issues for her and for the US government at large. We are all aware of Japan's high debt to GDP ratio, and I think there's broad agreement that economic growth through technological innovation is going to be one of the key aspects to get us out of this bind. That's one of the reasons I work in cryptocurrencies, is because I believe it will provide the basis of an open global financial system. So on the tech side, I think it will be critical for Japan and the US to cooperate, especially through private-public partnerships, bringing in actors and technologists in the private space to create sensible regulation and legislation that will strike the right balance between safety, making sure that innovation is responsible, but also not stifling growth and innovation.
Yeah, I mean, both you and Kojin are at the forefront of huge technological shifts in crypto and AI, and we were talking earlier about how the regulatory piece is just a big mystery right now, and but it's exciting. It's really exciting too. Thank you for that. So Molly, I'm going to turn to you. You're a speaker, an ice climber, a former climate advisor, and a mental health advocate. And in these capacities, you speak a lot about hope and hope-based leadership. So what would you say to the youth in both Japan and the US who many surveys have shown are losing their sense of hope currently?
Yeah, and it's a completely valid thing that there's a mental health crisis in both the US and Japan and across the world, especially when you look at the statistics of youth. And so how I arrived at actually thinking about hope as an actual solution was, one, there was a guy running for office years ago who was really inspiring to me, and his name was Barack Obama. But I couldn't pronounce his name, so I referred to him for over a week as Barack Obama. True story, so embarrassing. And years later, I found myself working as a climate advisor at the Obama White House, and I had this realization one night. You know what it's like when you have one of those sudden realizations about something you probably should have realized way sooner? I have those all the time. And so it was 2 a.m., I'm sitting at my desk, and suddenly it hits me. We were trying to do everything we could to move climate action forward, and we were facing a lot of obstruction. And my theory of change, it's like it started to evolve in real time, where we can't solve the climate crisis without systemic change, which you can't get without electeds, which you can't get without having the people on board. And here was my realization. You can't expect to have the people on board until they feel something. The idea that people need to feel something in order to act, I realized that might be key. So I started looking into psychology research, which is like a weird thing to be doing as a policy advisor. And one thing is tremendously clear, unequivocally, fear, guilt, shame, which is what I had seen dominate the climate narrative for decades, is actually antithetical to long-term action and motivation. And so we had seen people, say, be fearful, feel guilty, feel shame, and then saying, why aren't you acting? When we're actually taking away their ability to act, as the research would show. And then on the other side, I discovered the science of hope, which is something I had seen firsthand from following Obama around, which is that you don't actually have to be a very hopeful person in order to find a hopeful message incredibly appealing. And that's what we saw when he really changed the course of American politics and history, and winning on a message of hope. And so when I started looking into the research, it was pretty profound. Like, hope is associated with everything from cancer patients having a higher survival rate to a lower divorce rate among high hope couples, better life outcomes for childhood trauma survivors, children that can outperform kids who have higher IQs if they have increasing levels of hope, athletes being able to perform athletes of equal level. I realized that hope not only could impact climate, it could impact every sector of society. And that became this thought I had around what we were doing. And so my consultancy, we started working with organizations that were coming and saying, we have unprecedented challenges with employee mental health. I said, yes. Challenges around retention and productivity and how that's related to mental health. And so there we set out on this course to bring hope in as a solution across industries.
That's awesome. Fear, guilt, and hope. Well, we're all Japanese in this room, right? Or a lot of fear, guilt, and hope. But fear, guilt, and shame. Sorry. But no, that's really inspiring. And we talked a little bit about this, varying levels of hope, or just the decreasing levels of hope in the youth of both countries. Do you all see the Japanese youth as different from US youth, or are they the same? What are you seeing? I'm going to start with Kojun only because you recently lived in both countries and go back and forth a lot.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty different. I do have friend crowds in Japan, I spent my high school times together, and then my college friends from Harvard. And I think the big difference that I see is kind of people do say that generally speaking, the younger generation might not be as optimistic as the kind of older generation, but I tend to see that more maybe with my Japanese circles. Likely because since we were born, the economy has been stagnating, and we haven't seen a sign of light since we were born. So that's kind of ingrained in our DNA. And so I actually read a recent study that says Japanese younger generations don't want to get promoted, right? Because the wage is not going to go high, you have more responsibility, you have to work longer hours. So and I do see that kind of trait to some of my friends there. Whereas here, when I meet my fellow friends from Harvard, some of my friends are also starting a company, they're doing research, or they're devoting themselves in interesting technology or political activities, and I think those are all very stimulating, and I think they're also eager to get promoted. So I think those are all traits that I see are as very different.
I see. And so does that cause you concern as Japan tries to develop their startup ecosystem, promote entrepreneurship? If that's the prevailing sentiment, how do you get the youth to feel, I guess, the hope that they can start a company and take the leap?
Yeah, I'm very much concerned, and I think one of the reasons why I think that is the case is because when I look at, I'm an immigrant myself. My co-founder, he's also from Israel, and like 80% of our executive team is not from the U.S. originally, right? And our employees are all, a lot of them are, first generation, second generation immigrants, and we don't see a lot of that in Japan. And I think I know the policy is starting to change, but as we start to accept more foreign entrepreneurs to start businesses in Japan, I think that can be a big stimulus for the Japanese kind of who were born and raised there, because they get to see how the same generation from other countries are acting and being ambitious.
Yeah, that's interesting insight. What about you, Sarah? You've spent time fairly recently in both countries. What do you, and you grew up in the U.S., so kind of the opposite of Kojun. What do you see?
Yeah, I see a lot of overlap and similarities in what you're saying. I also taught middle school for 3 years on the JET program in Japan, and so I would also see in my students, if I gave a prompt about, what do you want to be in the future? It wasn't a language barrier that was causing them to struggle to answer the question. They genuinely didn't know and were scared to hope, and I think that a message like Molly's is really important about getting that across, and the importance of action over inaction, and that even though it might seem counterintuitive, you can get a lot more done just by trying and believing that you will succeed rather than trying to temper your expectations from the start. But in my industry, a concern that I have when it comes to the next generation actually stems from mis and disinformation, and it's that we're seeing, the way of entertainment. I'm going to date myself a bit. I was very big into Vine growing up, which now has been replaced and succeeded by TikTok and Instagram Reels. But our content is getting shorter and shorter, and our attention spans are also getting shorter and shorter. And in a world with so much happening geopolitically and where we have some really disturbing and upsetting headlines, the impulse to immediately share something the second you get it and to talk about it before being able to verify whether it is actually true information is extremely strong. And at the UN, there's initiatives to try and implement a pledge to pause or campaigns to get people to stop and take a second, breathe, and then verify this information independently before sharing it. But I think that, as the next generation, we're very concerned about the future, and so there's a extreme will to want to do better and to share upsetting news, but it can be taken advantage of, and that's a really important dimension to talk about when it comes to media and information literacy on both the US and the Japan side.
Yeah, those are really critical issues, and we were talking earlier today that you have the millennials who are digital natives, you have Gen Z who are sort of social natives, right? Grew up in the era of Instagram, and now that's kind of getting mature. And now this next generation, because of Kojun, is going to grow up as an AI native. And AI, Hugo was telling me, is going to be baked into our educational tools, right? I mean, it's already being integrated into many of, we at my company use Adobe software, and it's AI is just being automatically integrated into the software subscriptions that we purchase. So many of us are actually active consumers of AI without even knowing it. So it does bring up, what is this next gen? I mean, the current Gen Z, some of the mental health issues we're seeing are a direct result of social media. So what does AI present? I mean, there's so much opportunity, but also a lot that we have to be concerned about, which is why we have AI safety companies like Kojun's, that they're going to solve all of these problems for us, right, Kojun, right?
Hopefully, yes.
So maybe if I could turn to you, Yuga, can you tell me how important U.S. and Japan relations are to you? I know you're active in USJC, and maybe you can give us an example or tell us how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think being Japanese American, my father being American and my mother being Japanese, I think there's this Shakespeare quote that says, some people are born great, some people are become great, some people have greatness thrust upon them. I have U.S.-Japan relations thrust upon me. And so by the nature of my blood and my upbringing, I do feel a certain purpose to it because as a Japanese American, you occupy a unique place where your opinions and your feelings and your views are going to have a certain level of legitimacy. There are a number of issues in the U.S.-Japan relationship that are very important to me. Obviously, one theme that comes up a lot is global security. We had that wonderful session led by Josh Walker earlier at lunch. That's a big theme. I would say I want to dovetail off of what Sarah said on mis and disinformation, which I agree is an issue and is only going to proliferate in the age of generative AI. We will also have counterbalances to that through things like cryptographic attestations, zero-knowledge machine learning, and so forth. But I also want to say the flip side of that is that centralizing institutions can have destabilizing effects on the perception of legitimacy. Simply put, the youth trust in institutions is very, very low, especially in America. I think there was a Pew poll that said that the level of trust in Congress is currently at 7%, down from 12% in 2022. So I think if we want to counteract that, we have to recognize that we need to bring a coalition of people with varying views. We need to be very liberal in terms of what types of speech we allow. We need to be accepting of a wide range of viewpoints. And I'm very hopeful that our generation will be able to facilitate that because I think our generation is amongst the most diverse, both in the United States and amongst Japanese Americans.
Yeah, that's exciting. So, wow, you did it. You spouted off technology terms that I didn't know.
Sorry.
Before this panel, the two of them, they're geeking out and saying these, and I was just like, well, I'm just going to step back and just let them talk because I had no idea what they were talking about. But I'm sure it was really important. So, Molly, is there any aspect of U.S.-Japan relations that causes you concern? You're an optimist. You're a hope pusher, which is good. We need hope pushers. But is there anything that causes you concern?
Well, I mean, one of the core facets of hope that a lot of people don't realize, it gets mixed up with optimism. So optimism is specifically just the belief that the future will be better, period. This idea that good things happen to you, good things happen to the world, things turn out in the end. There's been a lot of pushback when we look at things like climate optimism, because there's this belief that it kind of makes people not act. And I can kind of see where people are coming from on that. Hope is specifically defined as the belief that the future can be better and that you have the agency to make it better. That's the difference. It's not wishful thinking. And that's why all of this research is showing how much it's tied to human motivation. In fact, if you look at their case studies where they've increased the hope level of doctors and nurses, and in the process, the cardiac arrest patient survival rate increases 20%. So when I'm thinking about these challenges, I think a big thing that we're seeing is this mental health crisis, which isn't just people diagnosed with mental illness. I live with bipolar II disorder. It's not just that. It's people who are experiencing a lack of hope. And we know from research that hope is a human need. If you don't feel hope, you are not okay. And what we're seeing right now, what you're talking about, are people who have trouble conceptualizing the future and therefore cannot believe there's any other way. And we need to believe that right now in order to act, right? You have to believe that the future can be better. And one of the things my consultancy, we kind of teach is this idea of showing the promised land. What does that look like for you? In the climate space, it's something we talk about in order to give people a sense of an endpoint. And for climate, that really is something around public health being improved. But there's a promised land in AI, in crypto, in healthcare, in tech, definitely in the United Nations, definitely in the vision for Japan, in the vision for the US, there's a promised land. And there's an opportunity to talk about what that looks like to open your eyes in that world. And an example in climate is specifically this idea that we can create a zero carbon economy. There is a destination here that we're working toward. And on mental health, it's the same thing, this belief that we can actually lessen suffering in the world, not just by curing people, but by alleviating societal challenges that are leading to a rational reaction where people are experiencing fear, suffering, pain, and that's impacting their ability to create and work toward that better future. But the more our countries, and in your work, in your companies, in your organizations, the more you can show what that promised land is, I guarantee the more people you'll get on board to back you.
Yeah, that's profound. And I think as leaders, instilling hope, it's challenging because we have wars now. People, we were having this conversation a year ago in my company, and some of the people that are younger were saying, they don't want to have kids. And I read that about Japanese youth. They don't want to have kids because why? Why would you have kids? It's expensive. You don't really have that much hope for the future. So, that's kind of alarming because we need to, up the kid production in Japan, right? To shift the demographic trends. So, what are you seeing that in your work too, Sarah, at the UN?
Yeah, I think Japan and Korea are always the two examples that get cited a lot, but it's not just them. I think as we're seeing inequality grow in huge droves, that it becomes more difficult to focus on anything other than essentially survival mode, which might sound like a very dramatic way of putting of it, but if you think of it and you're looking at how much rent has increased, inflation, wages and minimum wage not really going up in comparison to that, the ability to think about family planning and also just to have time to family plan too and to form relationships. A lot of people are tired, they're exhausted. The news cycle is also contributing in some ways in terms of the headlines and that feeling of despair. People don't have a sense of hope for the future. And I see here, especially with the Tomodachi generation and what we're working with, that this isn't an end point. There's reasons to be optimistic and to look forward to the future and to community builds and make a coalition, but a lot of it comes from stepping outside of the silos that we found ourselves in. Media content is very much targeted towards you based on what you're liking and looking at and scrolling through on your feeds. And you have to actively work to separate yourself from just receiving the same news and headlines over and over again, to leave your circles of comfort and talk to different people in order to gain a broader perspective of the world and see that there are a lot of ways to come together and that we have a lot more common ground than we think. Polarization is a really big word right now, and we talk about all of the areas and places where we disagree. But at the end of the day, when you talk to somebody about, I want to live a healthy, long life and to be happy and to have a relationship, those are all things that a lot of us can agree on and that want for, and we may have different ideas about what they look like, but at the end of the day, we all believe that we have a right to these things. And so, having these conversations is of critical importance to sort of break down beliefs that, there is no future and that there isn't a reason for us to hope.
Okay, well, so on that note, I'm going to ask each of you a final question. Okay? So, what gives you the most hope for the future? You start, Yuka.
Yeah, well, I'm Japanese American, and I often think, and this is in the context of the US-Japan relationship, what I think there's a lot of hope there. I often think sometimes Japanese have too few opinions, Americans have too many. And I actually think that is a very nice compliment. The two sort of cultures, ways of living, ways of thinking, actually cooperate together really nicely. And given that the US-Japan strategic relationship is at its strongest point right now, I think that portends something really good for the future. I also want to say for the young leaders in this room, as you saw on stage, you can have an impact simply by speaking out, especially to the class of 2023 of the Emerging Leaders Program. Woo! I want to impress upon you, please, 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 don't just engage or listen, speak up, assert, and describe your will. It can have an influence, and more than ever, I think the opinions of younger people are needed.
What about you, Molly?
Yeah, so as just one example in the climate space, at the White House, we actually did message testing because we wanted to understand what's the most effective way to talk about climate change with the American people, and we realized we didn't know, and we had all of these really unique, strange conditions we're experiencing with the American public around climate change, and we wanted to get to the bottom of it. And so we tested the most effective way to talk about it. And we found that the most effective way to talk about climate change was not by talking about climate-related disasters or national security. That just paralyzed people into inaction, right? The psychologist could have told us that. It wasn't by talking about the environment. Polar bears, glaciers, things happening thousands of miles away wasn't something that was relevant to a lot of people struggling to get by. And we found it wasn't by talking about the macroeconomy, too abstract for people to relate to in their everyday lives. By far, unequivocally, the most effective way to talk about climate change was through the lens of public health. Now, this is really interesting because both Japan and the US are facing this problem. When you look at climate change from the perspective of pollution, then I realized just a few years later, there's actually a counter to that implicit in the frame, which is a land of clean air. It's the only hope frame we'd actually tested. Isn't that interesting? And of course, it was the most effective one. When you fight climate change, you create more clean air for communities that currently cannot breathe. We know how oppressive it is to live in pollution. We know the public health impacts it has on our communities, right? Increased rates of cancer, heart disease, lung disease, miscarriage, impacts to male fertility, Alzheimer's, depression, the list goes on. And in Japan, the number one contributor to that is the transportation system. In the US, transportation, industry, our electricity system, all of these things are leading to this joint problem we're facing globally. The amazing thing is that when we talk about the promised land, we realize there was an opportunity to tell people what that looked like. And when you look at it from a climate public health frame, as we deploy more clean energy across our countries, there will now be children who will never have to know the pain and fear of an asthma attack. Parents who now get to be there to watch their children graduate, get married, whose lives would have otherwise been cut short from breathing pollution. We know that as we deploy and unleash more next generation technology, communities who live near our highways and have had to breathe traffic-related pollution will be freed from the burden of a rising Alzheimer's rate. People now get to watch their parents grow old in this world with minds clear and memories vivid. This is the power, the transformative power of social change that we're working toward jointly between our nations. It's the promised land. So we need to talk about that, what that is for our companies, our organizations, our families, our industries, and our communities, and our countries together.
That's great. Kojun, what about you? What gives you hope?
Yeah, I want to echo part of what Molly said about technology giving us hope for the future with solving a lot of the problems we have and the problems we discussed today. For example, the low birth rate and shrinking population in Japan. AI has a lot to do, can do a lot of things to solve those problems. I think in some part of it, right, this problem is inevitable if you look at the global trend, and at some point you have to rely on technology to automate some of the manual labor that we're doing today so that we don't have to rely on the underlying assumption of growing population, right? So, and there are many other examples where not just AI, but different technologies can solve these problems. And obviously, oftentimes, technologies is a double-edged sword, but I think the good news is that, specifically talking about AI, I think recently, both the US government and the Japanese government have been acting really quickly to try to tackle AI safety in a way that doesn't stifle innovation. And we've seen that a lot, and we've been trying to be part of that as well. And so I think if we, not just the technologists, but people in DC and people in New York, if we work together, right, to bring these technologies to the society in a way that's accepted by different people and can tackle real-world problems, then I think there's a lot of hope for the future to solve a lot of the fundamental problems that we're facing today.
Sarah, what about you?
I think I will just close it up by saying that being here today is very special to me because I actually joined the Tomodachi program with the Daiwa House Leadership Conference in 2016 in DC. And I have reflected back on it a lot, and in some ways the world has changed, but in many ways a lot of the issues we were talking about as young leaders then, rise in discrimination and hate speech, climate change, fears about healthcare, we were talking about the population rate even then. When I was talking with other peers, we had more questions than we did answers, and even though we did walk away with an idea of what are we going to do next, there was still a sense of we're too young, we don't have the tools, and we can't do anything. Talking to these same people and the next generation of people in Tomodachi, in ELP, people within the U40. I've been here since Tuesday, and I've had a lot of people come up to me and talk to me about their hopes and fears for the future over these past 3 days. And the one thing I found is, again, we have so much commonality and solidarity. We are building the coalitions. We have the political will. What we need is the tools. And so we need the platform and we need the tools to implement them. But if we have these things, I do have a lot of hope that these issues that we're talking about here can be solved together.
That's wonderful. And I mean, I know I'm not like the next gen leader, but as the old leader of the group, I'm just gonna put myself in with these guys. I'll say my hope for the future, and my hope is actually all of you, and many of the, actually all of you in this room. The thing that I was telling these guys earlier when we were having lunch, that I've been in the USJC, I think for about 10 years now, and I didn't want to join because my dad was like the board chair, and I was like, oh, who wants to join an organization their dad is in? It's your dad's organization. But actually, my dad's organization had the foresight to realize that really having an intentional strategy to bring in young people was what this organization needed. And so of all the organizations that I am a part of, the thing that I really cherish about this organization is that we have a very, free flow of generations. And my mentor, John Onoda, who is on the board of counselors and who has been my senpai for 3 decades, he always told me in the best mentorship relationships, the mentee becomes a mentor. And I think you've seen today that all of these people have taught me so much. I learn a lot from the ELP people. I learn a lot from the younger people in my company. And I hope that I also contribute to their learning. And I really, really hope that the USJC can continue to be a model of an organization where we don't have generational barriers, where we can all come together, teach each other, have my dad in the bar on Tuesday night talking to young people and these guys talking to me and not feeling those barriers, really learning from each other. I think that will enable us to really strengthen the US-Japan relationship and create opportunity economically, societally, politically, and really move both countries forward. So I really thank you all for your thought-provoking comments and insights, and I really appreciate hearing from you, and I'm going to learn from all of you in the future, as will all of us. So thank you.
Thank you.